You're not family. Not really. You never were. Patricia Mercer said it with a smile, the kind that looked warm from across the room but felt like a blade up close. And she said it while pointing Hannah Whitaker toward a folding chair by the fireplace, as if 30 years of Thanksgivings had led to exactly this moment, this seat, this sentence. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a family pausing to say grace, but the sharp, uncomfortable silence of people who all knew something was wrong and had decided, once again, to say nothing. Hannah stood in the doorway in a damp coat, holding a pecan pie she'd baked after a 16-hour hospice shift, the smell of hospital antiseptic still faintly clinging to her sleeves. She had told herself, driving up the mountain that morning, that maybe this year would be different. It never was. But hope has a stubborn way of returning every November, no matter how many times it's been disappointed. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She walked to the folding chair, set the pie down beside it, and sat, one hand resting quietly against the plain white envelope tucked inside her coat. None of them noticed that her stillness wasn't defeat. It was patience running out. Welcome back to the family revenge tales. To understand what was inside that envelope and why Hannah's silence that day was more dangerous than any scream could have been, you have to go back nearly 30 years to a 6-year-old girl standing at her mother's funeral in a black dress 2 sizes too big for her. Margaret Whitaker had died young, leaving behind an apple orchard that 4 generations of Whitakers had carved out of the Blue Ridge Mountains with their own hands. Hannah's father, Thomas, remarried within 2 years. Patricia Mercer moved into the farmhouse with her daughter, Madison, and something in the air of that house shifted the very first week, something a child couldn't name but felt in her bones every single day afterward. Patricia was never cruel in ways anyone could point to. She never raised her hand. Her cruelty lived somewhere quieter, in birthdays that were somehow always forgotten until someone else reminded her, in Christmas mornings when Madison unwrapped a new bicycle, while Hannah received a used sweater, because growing girls don't need much. In dinner conversations where Hannah's opinions simply never seemed to register, as though she were furniture rather than family. "You're not ungrateful, are you, Hannah?" Patricia would ask, sweetly, whenever tears threatened to surface. "After everything we've given you?" Only one person in that house ever seemed to notice. Lucas, 6 years younger, too small to understand the quiet politics of favoritism, but old enough to know that leaving a warm dinner roll outside his sister's door on the nights she was sent to bed hungry made her smile the next morning. Those small, secret kindnesses became, in Hannah's memory, some of the only proof that love had ever actually lived in that house. She grew up anyway. She became a hospice nurse, spending her days sitting beside strangers in their final hours, helping families find peace in the middle of devastating loss. It was, she sometimes thought, a strange kind of irony. A woman who helped others find closure had never once found it in her own family. She had made peace, or told herself she had, with the idea that some wounds simply don't heal. Until the day her father collapsed in the orchard from a heart attack, and Hannah found herself at his bedside, then later at his desk, searching a drawer for his insurance card. That was when she found the key. Small, brass, tucked inside a velvet pouch at the back of the drawer, a tag looped around it that read, "Safe Deposit Box 112. Beside it, an old receipt, yellowed with age, bearing her mother's signature. "What is this?" she asked when Thomas was well enough to speak, holding the key out toward him. His face went pale before he even answered. He reached out and took it from her hand so quickly it startled her. "Old paperwork from your mother's estate. It's nothing." His hands were shaking as he said it. Hannah had spent years learning to read the faces of dying patients and grieving families. She knew the difference between nothing and a man terrified of what the truth might cost him. She rented the box herself 2 days later, alone, her heart pounding the entire drive to the bank. Inside, she found letters in her mother's handwriting, photographs she had never seen, an old leather journal with a cracked spine, a property survey of the orchard, and beneath all of it, a folder simply labeled Trust Agreement, Whitaker Family Orchard. She sat on the floor of that small private room until the lights dimmed for closing, reading everything twice, understanding almost nothing, and yet feeling somehow that everything had already changed. That same evening, she drove to see Dorothy Callahan, an elderly neighbor who had been her mother's closest friend for over 20 years. Dorothy opened the door in her housecoat, and the moment the porch light fell across Hannah's face, she went very still.
"You have her eyes," she said softly. "You always have." She disappeared into a back room and returned with a weathered cedar chest, setting it gently on the coffee table between them. "Your mother asked me to keep this. I promised her I would, for as long as it took for the right moment to find you." Inside was a letter, the ink slightly faded, dated only weeks before Margaret's death. "My dearest Hannah," it began, "if you are reading this, I am no longer there to protect you myself, and there is something you need to know. I have watched your father grow weaker under pressure from people who care more about this land than they will ever care about you. I am afraid that one day, someone will convince him to sell what took generations to build. So, I have made sure that cannot happen. This orchard was never meant to leave our family. It was never meant to leave you." Hannah's hands trembled as she read on. Her mother had placed the entire orchard into an irrevocable trust before she died, naming Hannah the sole beneficiary, with Thomas serving only as trustee, a caretaker, never an owner, until Hannah turned 35. She was 34. Rebecca Mitchell, the estate attorney Hannah hired the following week, confirmed everything within days. The trust was legitimate, active, airtight. Thomas had never legally owned a single acre of that orchard. His only responsibility for nearly 30 years had been to protect it for his daughter, and instead, he had let an entire family, an entire community, believe it was his. "There's something else," Rebecca said gravely during their final meeting, sliding a folder across the desk. "Your father isn't the only problem here." Madison, it turned out, had recently taken out a substantial loan to expand her wedding planning business, using the orchard itself as collateral. The paperwork had been prepared and filed by Gerald Mercer, Patricia's brother, a practicing attorney who should have known better than anyone that neither he nor Madison had any legal right to pledge property they never owned. Hannah sat with that knowledge for days, turning it over quietly. She could have gone to her family with fury. After 30 years of small humiliations, she had more than earned the right to walk in and burn it all down. But instead, she chose something harder and something that felt more like her mother. She chose dignity. She had Rebecca prepare certified copies of every document, the trust, the survey, a formal accounting demand, all of it, sealed inside one plain white envelope. And then she waited for Thanksgiving. Which brings us back to that folding chair by the fireplace, where Hannah sat through an entire dinner she hadn't been invited to share, listening to laughter that wasn't hers, watching a table that had never once made room for her. When the pumpkin pie had been served, and the room had grown warm and loud with other people's joy, Hannah finally stood. She walked to where her father sat and placed the envelope gently in front of him. "What is this?" Thomas asked, his voice already unsteady, as if some buried part of him already knew. "Open it," Hannah said quietly. Patricia reached over before he could, tearing it open with the same confidence she had worn like armor for 30 years. But her expression began to change with every page, the smile faltering, then disappearing, then collapsing into something close to fear. "This has to be a mistake," she said, her voice losing its usual command. "There's no way this is real." "It's real. Every Thanksgiving we've celebrated in this house since my mother died has taken place on land that belongs to me, not because I fought for it, because she made sure of it before I even understood what losing her would mean." The table, so loud a moment before, went utterly silent. Somewhere behind her, Hannah heard a fork set down against a plate, slow and careful, as though even that small sound might shatter something. Thomas's hands shook as he took the papers from his wife. He read them slowly, his lips moving faintly over the legal language, and something in his face finally broke. Not surprise, Hannah realized as she watched him. Shame. "You knew." It wasn't a question. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and his voice, when it came, sounded smaller than she had ever heard him. "I've known since the week after your mother's funeral. I told myself I'd tell you when you were older, then when you turned 18, then 25. Every single year I found a new reason to wait, because telling you meant telling Patricia, and I never had the courage for that fight. So instead," Hannah said, her voice steady even as her eyes burned, "you let me believe I didn't belong here for 30 years. "I was weak," Thomas whispered. "I was wrong and I was weak, and I am so sorry." Across the table, Madison had gone pale, already calculating what a collapsed loan would mean for the business she had built her entire identity around. Gerald pushed back his chair and quietly excused himself, already reaching for his phone before he'd even left the room. Patricia sat frozen, the papers still trembling in her hands. 30 years of carefully constructed authority dissolving in front of a room full of witnesses. Hannah never raised her voice, not once. She simply stood there and let the documents say what she had never been allowed to say herself. Later that night, long after most of the guests had quietly slipped out into the cold, Hannah sat with Lucas on the porch steps, their breath fogging in the mountain air. "I always knew something wasn't right," he said, staring out at the dark orchard rows. "I just didn't have the words for it when I was a kid. I'm sorry I didn't do more." "You did more than you'll ever know," Hannah said, bumping her shoulder gently against his. "You're the reason I still believed someone in that house loved me." "What happens now?" he asked. "You'll always have a home here. That's not in question. Neither is Madison's little girl. Whatever happens with the adults, she didn't choose any of this, and she's not going to pay for it." Justice, Hannah had decided long before that Thanksgiving, was never about creating new victims. It was about restoring what had been stolen: truth, dignity, and a name. In the months that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly but completely. Madison's business collapsed once the improperly pledged collateral was removed, forcing her to rebuild from nothing. Gerald faced a formal investigation from the State Bar Association. Thomas and Patricia were given time to relocate, and though their marriage never fully recovered from the weight of the secret, Thomas finally began attending grief counseling, something he had never allowed himself to do in all the years since Margaret's death. On Hannah's 35th birthday, ownership of the orchard officially transferred into her name. She stood at the old wooden entrance sign, weathered and faded after decades of neglect, and with Lucas beside her, sanded and repainted it by hand until the words Whitaker Family Orchard could be read clearly again from the road below. Drawing on years spent sitting with families in their most fragile hours, Hannah transformed part of the old farmhouse into a quiet retreat for people grieving the loss of someone they loved, a place where no one would ever again be told there wasn't a seat for them at the table. If this story moved you and you believe truth always finds its way home eventually, consider subscribing to the Family Revenge Tales. We tell the stories of ordinary people who found the courage to reclaim what was rightfully theirs, not through anger, but through quiet, unshakable strength. Because sometimes the very people who spend years convincing you that you don't belong are standing on ground that was always meant to be yours. And the greatest inheritance anyone can ever claim isn't land or money or a seat at someone else's table. It's the courage to finally stand in your own truth. What is the significant educational or other value in this story? This story shows that emotional neglect and quiet favoritism, even without visible cruelty, leave wounds just as real as any spoken insult, and those wounds deserve to be named and healed. It teaches that justice rarely needs anger to be effective. Patience, preparation, and truth can accomplish what rage never could. The story also honors the quiet power of a parent's foresight, showing how Margaret's decision to protect her daughter reached across decades to change her future. Finally, it reminds viewers that real strength lies in choosing mercy even after profound betrayal, protecting the innocent rather than letting revenge cause more harm than the original wound.